Chapter 1: The Rejection. The grand hall of the palace buzzed with anticipation as the bonding auction ceremony began. Nobles and alphas from across the kingdom filled the lavish room, their eyes gleaming with hunger as they waited to see which Omega would be chosen to satisfy their need for power, submission, and control. The walls of the hall were adorned with tapestries of ancient victories, banners of powerful families, and golden chandeliers that sparkled in the dim light. Everything about the night screamed wealth, power, and tradition. Orfilia stood at the back of the room, her position as a quiet maid keeping her mostly invisible to the crowded space. She had no stake in the ceremony, except for the fact that it always left her uneasy. She had seen Omegas like herself paraded, chosen, and sold like cattle. Yet, she could not escape the sadness that came with each silent moment. The lives of these women would be forever changed, their futures tied to the whims of powerful, controlling alphas. Her heart ached for them, but she had learned long ago to keep her emotions hidden. Tonight, though, something was different. The doors to the hall swung open, and a figure stepped into the room that commanded the attention of every person present. His presence was magnetic, heavy and intense. The Alpha Scot had entered. His tall, broad frame was cloaked in a dark, tailored suit, his sharp jawline and the cold, intense gaze in his eyes sending a ripple through the room. He was no ordinary Alpha. There was something different about him. His features were beautiful, though there was an air of sorrow, of quiet torment, that lingered beneath the stoic facade. His raven-black hair fell just over his brow, and his wolf-like eyes scanned the room, taking in everything and everyone. The room fell silent as he made his way down the aisle, his presence making even the most seasoned alphas shrink back, avoiding eye contact. There was a quiet murmur, whispers of judgment, as people eyed him. Yet he was the Alpha Scot, a name once revered, now nothing but a reminder of a broken past. The auctioneer called for bids, but no one raised their hand. The room's gaze shifted away from him, as though his rejection was something that could not be undone. The king's command to put Scott in the auction had been a formality, but as the minutes passed, Scott's position became clearer. He was unwanted, despite the powerful blood that ran through his veins. Orfilia's chest tightened as she watched him stand there, rejected by everyone, alone in a sea of cold faces. He didn't belong here, and yet he was trapped just like her. It was then that something in Orfilia's heart whispered to her. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put words to the connection she felt, but she knew she had to speak to him, to reach out. With careful steps she approached him. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, but she couldn't let the moment pass. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her words just loud enough to reach his ears. He turned, surprise flashing in his golden eyes before it melted into something unreadable. "I'm fine," he answered curtly, yet his voice cracked just slightly, betraying the weariness within him. But Orfilia could see it. The rejection, the loneliness. It was written across his face. "No one should be left like this," she said, her gaze softening as she took another step closer. The Alpha Scot's eyes lingered on her for a long moment, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. And then, for the first time that evening, the faintest trace of something flickered in his expression, something like hope but tinged with deep sorrow. Chapter 2: The Unseen Bond. Days passed since the rejection at the bonding auction, but the image of Scott's pain lingered in Orfilia's thoughts. The other maids didn't speak of it, and neither did the nobles. But Orfilia couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something between her and Scott that neither of them had expected. She continued her duties in silence as she always did. She cleaned the royal chambers, prepared meals for the council, and served the nobles. But her mind often drifted to the memory of that moment in the auction hall. Scott's eyes, the way he had looked at her, confused at first but then something softer, almost accepting. It wasn't until the evening when she returned to the royal gardens that she saw him again. He stood alone, his back to her, gazing up at the full moon. The silver light bathed his features, casting long shadows on his face. Orfilia hesitated at the entrance of the garden, watching him from afar. There was an aura of quiet devastation about him. Despite being surrounded by the riches and the power of the royal palace, Scott was a man lost, broken in a way Orfilia could never truly understand, but could somehow feel. Without thinking, she moved toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. Her steps were light, careful. When she reached him, she didn't know what to say, only that she had to speak again. "I didn't mean to offend you," she began, her voice barely a whisper, unsure if he would even hear her. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't offend me," he replied, his voice quieter than before. "I'm just not used to kindness." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Not used to kindness?" she echoed softly. "Why not? Everyone deserves kindness." Scott's gaze softened, the hardness in his eyes momentarily giving way to something else, something warmer. "I was born into power," he explained, his voice tinged with bitterness. "And power doesn't ask for kindness. It demands submission." Orfilia watched him, her heart aching. "And what if you don't want to submit?" she asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment, he simply stared at her, as though considering the weight of her words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Then you end up here." Chapter 3: The Quiet Shift. Over the following weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Scott would find her in the gardens or in the palace halls, and though they rarely spoke, Orfilia always sensed the tension between them, the connection that was growing stronger each day. At first, it was just a passing glance or a few exchanged words, but it was undeniable. The bond was forming. There was something about Orfilia that reached into Scott's soul. Her calm presence, her kindness in a world that had cast him aside. It was all a stark contrast to everything he had come to expect. She treated him as if he were not a broken alpha, not someone to pity, but someone worthy of respect, of attention, of care. And slowly he found himself craving that care. One afternoon, Scott found himself walking through the halls when he heard her humming softly. It was a song gentle and sweet, that seemed out of place in the cold, opulent palace. The sound was a balm to his soul, soothing the jagged edges of his thoughts. He followed the sound to its source and found her there, sweeping the floors with a quiet grace, her focus entirely on her task. Orfilia didn't notice him right away, but when she did, she turned and smiled, her expression warm. It was as though she had sensed him, even before he had walked into the room. "Scott," she greeted softly, "I didn't expect to see you here today." He shrugged, though his heart was racing. "I didn't expect to come either," he admitted. "But I wanted to hear the rest of the song." Her cheeks flushed, a delicate pink rising to her skin. "It's nothing important." He shook his head, stepping closer, drawn by the warmth of her presence. "It's important to me," he said, his voice softening. The look in her eyes told him that she understood, even without words. And in that moment, the bond between them seemed undeniable. Chapter 4. A Bond Unraveled. As time passed, the bond between Scott and Orfilia grew deeper, but with it came complications. The more they saw each other, the more they were drawn into a world of secrecy and danger. Orfilia was not blind to the politics of the royal court. She knew the dangers of being involved with Scott. He was the rejected alpha, an outcast, and his connection with her could cost them both dearly. But there was a part of her that couldn't let go, couldn't walk away. She had seen the pain in his eyes, and she knew it wasn't just about being rejected at the auction. There was something more to him, something buried deep beneath the layers of pain and pride. And that something, she realized, was what had drawn her to him in the first place. But Orfilia was no fool. She knew that the world they lived in didn't care for weak bonds. It only cared for power. And the truth was she wasn't sure if their bond could withstand what was coming next. Chapter 5. Forbidden Desire. The desire between them was undeniable, simmering beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing moment. They had become more than just quiet companions. They were drawn to each other in a way neither could explain. One night, as the full moon cast its silver glow over the garden, Orfilia stood by the fountain, her thoughts lost in the stars. She hadn't expected Scott to come, but she sensed him before she heard his footsteps. "Orfilia," he whispered, his voice low and husky. "I can't keep pretending I don't feel this. What is this between us?" Orfilia turned to face him, her heart racing. She wanted to say something, anything to make sense of the growing tension, but the words failed her. He stepped closer, his eyes dark with desire. "Scott," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Before she could say anything else, he closed the distance between them, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was tender but filled with desperation. The moment their lips met, it was like the world around them disappeared, leaving only the heat of their connection. Chapter 6. Growing Tension. The days following their kiss were filled with unbearable tension. Every moment Orfilia spent near Scott only deepened the bond between them, a bond neither could ignore, though both were terrified of its consequences. Orfilia, who had always been observant of others but never truly seen herself, now found herself constantly aware of her every glance, her every touch when Scott was near. The air between them seemed to crackle, charged with something both electric and dangerous. The weight of their unspoken feelings hung between them, thick with need and fear. In the mornings, they would cross paths in the palace halls. His gaze would linger on her for just a moment longer than necessary, and in that brief second, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that both of them knew but neither was ready to confront. Orfilia tried to focus on her duties, but it became increasingly difficult. Her tasks, once routine and comforting, now felt meaningless. She couldn't shake the memory of his lips on hers, the way his hands had gripped her waist, pulling her closer to him, as though he couldn't get close enough. The heat of that moment burned in her veins, and no matter how much she tried to push it away, she couldn't. Scott, on the other hand, was battling his own demons. His wolf, who had been dormant for so long, was awake, restlessly pushing against the boundaries he had carefully crafted. The desire to claim Orfilia as his fully and completely was growing stronger with every passing day. His wolf howled in his chest, demanding that he take her, that he make her his. But Scott couldn't. He couldn't risk losing her, not after everything he'd already lost. One afternoon, as they found themselves alone in the royal library, both seeking refuge from the world outside, Scott finally spoke, breaking the silence that had built up between them. "Orfilia," he said, his voice low, his eyes dark with the weight of the feelings he could no longer ignore. "I can't keep pretending I don't want this. Want you. I need you, but I can't protect you if you're caught in this. If this bond becomes known." Orfilia's heart clenched at the raw vulnerability in his voice. She stepped closer, her breath shallow as she met his gaze. "You don't need to protect me from this. I want to be with you, Scott. But I'm scared too. What will happen to us? To you?" He stepped closer to her, his hand hovering inches from her cheek. The longing in his eyes was almost painful to witness. "If you want to be with me," he whispered, "then the consequences will follow, and we'll have to face them together." Chapter 7. Forced Proximity. The tension between them had reached its breaking point. One evening, as part of the royal proceedings, Scott and Orfilia found themselves forced into close proximity once again. The royal banquet hall was filled with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of glasses. Everyone in the palace had gathered to celebrate a successful diplomatic meeting, but Orfilia's attention was entirely focused on Scott, who stood at the far end of the room, his posture rigid, his eyes dark and distant. They had not spoken of their kiss, not aloud. But every time they crossed paths, the unspoken words were louder than ever. And tonight, it felt as though everything between them would finally erupt. As the evening wore on, the king motioned for Scott to join him at the head of the table, and Orfilia was directed to serve the drinks. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the wine, her mind constantly racing back to the brief moments of closeness she had shared with Scott. Every time she approached him to offer the glass, their eyes would meet, and the world around them would seem to vanish. She could feel his presence pulling her in, the electricity between them undeniable. He too seemed to be struggling with the proximity. The tension between them was palpable. At one point, she found herself standing just behind him, her hands brushing against the back of his chair as she served the next course. It was in that fleeting moment that Scott's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising force, stopping her. Orfilia turned to face him, her heart pounding. He leaned in closer, his lips grazing her ear. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, his voice thick with need. "I can't pretend like I'm not going insane every time you're near me." She didn't pull away. She couldn't. The bond between them was far too strong. Instead, she leaned into him, her breath coming faster. "Then don't," she said, her voice hushed but filled with quiet determination. "Don't pretend anymore." But just as she thought he might pull her closer, the king called for attention, and the moment was shattered. Scott released her wrist, his expression hardening as he turned away. Chapter 8: The First Test. The unspoken bond between them was about to be tested. News arrived that a rival alpha, a member of a powerful clan, had come to court under false pretenses. His name was Varek, and his reputation was notorious for his ruthless methods of gaining power. As he entered the royal court, there was a noticeable shift in the air. Everyone, from the nobles to the servants, could feel the tension. His eyes swept across the room, landing on Scott for a brief moment, before moving on to the other alphas. Orfilia couldn't help but notice Varek's interest in her. His gaze lingered just a little too long, his smile too knowing. It made her skin crawl. Scott seemed to sense the same thing. His body went rigid, and she could see the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Varek was a threat, not just to Scott but to everything they had started to build. As the evening wore on, Varek's advances became more pointed. He made several remarks about Orfilia, remarks that, while not outright offensive, carried an undertone of possessiveness. Every time Varek's gaze met hers, she felt her heart race, her palms begin to sweat. He was testing her and he was testing Scott. Scott's wolf was restless again. She could feel the weight of his presence at her side, his tension palpable. She knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to challenge Varek to eliminate the threat. But Orfilia wasn't sure she could stand by and watch. The consequences would be devastating. Varek's approach came swiftly, his steps calculated. He moved to Orfilia's side and placed a hand on her arm. "You have a remarkable woman by your side, Scott," Varek said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "But I wonder if she knows the true cost of her loyalty." Orfilia's stomach churned at the insinuation, and before she could respond, Scott's voice cut through the air, low and commanding. "Keep your hands off her, Varek," he warned, his tone cold. But Varek only smiled, his gaze never leaving Orfilia's. "I think she might like it better if she were with someone who knows how to treat her." Orfilia's pulse quickened as Scott's grip on his drink tightened, his knuckles white. But before the situation could escalate, Orfilia stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Scott's arm. "He doesn't mean anything," she said firmly, her voice steady. But inside she was trembling. Her instincts were screaming at her to retreat, but she couldn't let Scott be torn apart by Varric. Scott's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at her, and though he didn't speak, she could feel his gratitude. He took a breath, calming himself, but the unease lingered in the air between them. Chapter 9. Unraveling Loyalties. The court continued its delicate dance of power and intrigue, but the cracks in the facade were starting to show. Orfilia couldn't escape the growing tension between Scott and the other nobles. Varric's presence at the palace had only amplified the deep-rooted divisions among the alphas. It wasn't just Scott who was being tested. It was everything Orfilia had believed about the world she was living in. As the days passed, whispers filled the palace halls. Some of the nobles began to grow suspicious of Scott's closeness to Orfilia. The more they saw him with her, the more dangerous it became for both of them. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Orfilia found herself alone with Scott in the royal garden. She could feel his inner turmoil as he paced before her. His wolf was agitated again, the animal inside him pushing for control. "They're talking about us, Orfilia," he said, his voice a low growl. "They'll use you against me. They'll use everything." She stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out for his. "They won't win," she said softly. "We won't let them." Scott's eyes darkened as he stared at her. "But they already are. And they will keep coming. You have no idea what they're capable of." "I don't care what they think," Orfilia replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "I care about you." He froze, his body going still as he looked at her. "You shouldn't. It's dangerous." "I don't care," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "I choose you." The bond between them, unbreakable and fierce, was tested, but in that moment it felt stronger than ever. Chapter 11. The Consequences of Choosing. The days after the king's ultimatum felt like a slow march toward inevitable disaster. Orfilia could feel the weight of the decision she had made to stay with Scott hanging heavily between them. The palace was a web of whispered rumors, cold stares, and political maneuvering. She had known the consequences, but now that they were real, they seemed almost too much to bear. Scott, on the other hand, had become distant, lost in thought, his demeanor colder than she had ever seen it. He was struggling, torn between the need to protect her and the desire to honor the responsibilities that came with his title, despite his rejection. His wolf was restlessly pacing inside him, urging him to claim her fully, but he knew that doing so would only make things more dangerous. Orfilia found herself growing frustrated by his reluctance to confront what they both felt. She wasn't afraid of the consequences, not anymore. She had made her choice, and it was with him. Every moment apart from him was a slow agony, a quiet ache that gnawed at her heart. But Scott seemed to pull away more with each passing day, leaving her with a gnawing uncertainty she could not shake. One evening, Orfilia couldn't take it anymore. She found him standing by the palace balcony, his back to her, staring out over the sprawling kingdom below. He was always so distant, so alone. "Scott," she called softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. He didn't turn, but she could hear the tension in his breath as he spoke. "You should go, Orfilia. I told you this was too dangerous." She stepped closer, her heart racing in her chest. "I've already made my choice. I'm not leaving." His voice, when it came, was rough and thick with unshed emotion. "But if you stay, you'll be torn apart. You'll lose everything." "I'll lose everything if I leave you," she whispered, her hand reaching for his, her fingers brushing against the cool stone of the balcony. "I would rather face the consequences with you than live without you." Scott's shoulders tightened, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Finally he turned, his eyes dark with frustration and longing. "Do you understand what you're saying? What we have will change everything." "Everything." Orfilia nodded, her resolve hardening. I'm not afraid of change. I'm afraid of never knowing what we could be. The tension between them snapped, and without another word, Scott closed the distance between them, pulling her into his arms. His lips crashed against hers with a force that took her breath away, and in that moment all the doubts, the fears, and the outside world melted away. Chapter 12. The Heart's Wild Yearning. The night that followed was like no other Orfilia had ever known. The kiss they had shared burned in her veins, a flame that refused to be extinguished. She had never imagined something so consuming, so overwhelming. But here she was standing in the arms of the Alpha Scott, a man whose very presence made her pulse race, whose every touch sent her heart spiraling into a wild frenzy. But as much as she wanted to surrender to the intensity of their bond, Orfilia knew that the world they were in would never allow them the peace they so desperately sought. The king's warning loomed over them both, and the court was watching them closely, waiting for them to slip up. Orfilia lay awake that night, her thoughts consumed by what had happened between her and Scott. The way he had kissed her, like a man starved for something real, something pure. The hunger in his eyes was unmistakable, and it terrified her. She knew his wolf, his beast, was relentless, a force of nature that would stop at nothing to claim her as his. But Orfilia had never felt so alive. His touch ignited something inside her that she didn't even know existed, a need to be closer to him, to be consumed by him. And yet, every time she let herself get lost in that desire, the reality of their situation would return, like a cold wind cutting through her. She had never been so torn between fear and longing. Chapter 13. The Cost of Loyalty. The following days tested their bond in ways neither of them had anticipated. The political climate within the palace was becoming more volatile. Varric, their rival Alpha, had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to gain control of Scott's power, and his eyes were now firmly fixed on Orfilia. She could feel it, the weight of his gaze, the way he lingered just a little too long when their paths crossed. Varric was dangerous, and he knew how to use people. He was a master at manipulating situations, and Orfilia feared he was already plotting to use her to destroy Scott. One night, as Orfilia walked through the palace gardens, she felt the sharp sting of eyes on her. Varric stepped out from the shadows, his smile all too knowing. "Orfilia," he greeted, his voice low and smooth. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Her skin crawled, but she did her best to keep her composure. "What do you want, Varric?" He chuckled softly, stepping closer. "What do I want? Oh, just a little chat. You see, I've been watching you and Scott, and I can't help but wonder, how much do you really know about him? About what he's capable of?" Orfilia's heart skipped a beat. "I don't know what you're talking about." Varric smiled, but there was something cold behind his eyes. "You may think you're his ally, his love, but in the end all alphas are the same. They take what they want and they destroy everything in their path. You're just a piece in his game." Orfilia swallowed the fear rising in her throat. "I'm not a piece, and I won't be used by you or anyone else." Varric's grin widened and he stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "You'll see. Scott will be nothing but a shadow of the man you think he is. And when he betrays you, I'll be here." Her chest tightened, the words hitting her harder than she expected. She had never felt more alone, even with Scott by her side. And yet she couldn't back down. Not now. Chapter 14. A Line in the Sand. Orfilia's fears were realized sooner than she expected. News of Scott's supposed betrayal, fueled by Varric's lies, spread through the court like wildfire. Nobles, advisors, even the servants in the lower halls began to whisper. The story was simple. Scott had been using Orfilia for his own gain, just like all alphas did. Orfilia couldn't believe it, not for a second. She knew Scott. She knew the pain he carried, the burden of being cast aside for so long. But the court? The council? They were unforgiving. And in their eyes, Scott had already made his mistake. It was in the palace's grand hall, during a rare council meeting, that the situation reached its breaking point. The king, his eyes cold and unreadable, called Scott forward. "Alpha Scott," the king's voice echoed through the room. "Your actions have put the integrity of this court in jeopardy. You have violated our trust and tarnished your honor." Orfilia's heart pounded in her chest as Scott stood, his face a mask of stoic indifference. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but she could see the flicker of hurt in his eyes. He wasn't just being condemned by the king, he was being condemned by the very people he had once called his allies. Scott stood tall, though every fiber of his being wanted to fight, to lash out. But he knew what would happen if he did. The consequences would be catastrophic. "I didn't betray anyone," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I would never betray the people I care about." The king's gaze hardened. "You've already shown us who you truly are." And that was when Orfilia knew. She knew the court would never accept them. She knew that the bond between her and Scott would cost them both everything. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now. She stood, her voice ringing clear across the hall. "You can't tear us apart," she said. "This bond is stronger than all of you." Chapter 15, The Final Stand. Everything changed that night. Scott and Orfilia found themselves at the center of a storm they could no longer avoid. Varroc's scheme to tear them apart had succeeded in sowing enough doubt and fear among the nobles. Now they were fighting not just for their love, but for their very survival in a world that had turned against them. The king issued a decree. Scott would be exiled from the court, and Orfilia would be forced to sever her ties with him, or face severe consequences. The decision was clear, but Orfilia could not walk away. She refused to. Standing before Scott, Orfilia made her decision. "If they want us apart, then we'll fight for each other. We'll fight for this bond, no matter the cost." Scott's gaze softened, the weight of her words sinking in. He reached for her hand, his grip tight and reassuring. "Together," he whispered. The tension that had built between them now felt like a storm ready to burst open. But Orfilia knew, deep in her heart, that this was the beginning of something that could change everything. The court, the king, and even Varroc, they would all learn that they were not going to tear apart what Scott and Orfilia had built, no matter the cost. Chapter 16, A Shifting Tide. The tension in the air felt thick enough to cut with a knife. The kingdom's court had shifted, but it wasn't just the politics that weighed heavily on Orfilia and Scott. It was the growing sense that they were walking a fine line, caught between loyalty and survival. Every move they made was scrutinized, and each step they took toward the future seemed to come with a price they could no longer ignore. In the days following their confrontation with the king, Orfilia and Scott were forced into isolation. The royal palace, which had once felt like their home, now felt like a prison. They were cut off from the rest of the world, left to their own devices. The council's decision to exile Scott loomed over them like a dark cloud, and even though they had decided to stand by each other, the weight of that decision was beginning to take its toll. The once vibrant halls of the palace now felt stifling. The walls closed in around Orfilia as she moved through the quiet corridors, her heart heavy with the fear that Scott would be lost to her forever. She hadn't seen him for hours, and though she knew he was nearby, she felt a gnawing emptiness at the thought of being without him. That evening she found him in the courtyard, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped below the trees. The soft glow of twilight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the weariness that had settled in his features. He was alone, but in that solitude Orfilia saw something in him. Something broken, something that mirrored her own heart. She approached him cautiously, the weight of her footsteps grounding her in the moment. "Scott," she called softly, her voice trembling with unspoken emotion. He turned to face her, his eyes darkened with exhaustion but still filled with the intensity that had drawn her to him in the first place. His lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead he simply reached out, pulling her close. She didn't resist. She never could. For a long time they stood there in silence, wrapped in each other's arms, their bond pulsing between them like a heartbeat. The outside world seemed to fade away. And in that moment, Orfilia realized that it didn't matter what anyone else thought. What mattered was the truth between them, the bond they had forged, the love they had found in each other. "You don't have to face this alone," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." Scott's grip tightened, his face burying into the crook of her neck. His words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of his soul. "I don't deserve you, Orfilia." "You're wrong," she whispered back, her fingers running through his hair. "You've always been worthy of love. And I'll fight for you. I'll fight for us." Chapter 17 The Weight of Power. The days turned into weeks, and the palace grew even colder. Scott's exile had been formally declared, but the decision had yet to be enforced. The pressure from the court to remove him from power continued to mount, but Scott refused to back down. He wasn't about to give up without a fight, especially when it came to Orfilia. But the stakes were higher now. Varec, whose manipulation had caused much of the division, was not one to let things go. He knew that Scott's defiance could bring about his downfall, and Varec was a master at playing the game of power. The rival Alpha had already begun to weave a network of support, gathering allies among the court's most influential families. And as Scott's position grew more tenuous, Varec's plan took shape. Orfilia could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of it almost suffocating. She spent more and more time in the quiet corners of the palace, praying that the situation wouldn't escalate. She had never imagined that the bond between her and Scott would lead to such a complex, dangerous web. But here they were, standing on the edge of a precipice. One evening, as the royal banquet unfolded in the grand hall, Orfilia caught sight of Varec's unmistakable figure at the far end of the room. His eyes locked with hers for a moment, and she could feel the malice in his gaze, as though he were daring her to challenge him. She immediately turned away, seeking solace in the quiet halls, but the chill in the air didn't do much to calm the storm brewing in her chest. She knew that they couldn't keep avoiding Varec. It was only a matter of time before he made his next move. As she passed through the darkened corridors, she found Scott waiting for her near the grand staircase. His jaw was clenched, his eyes filled with determination. "He's making his move," he said, his voice grim. "Varec's not going to stop until he takes everything from us." Orfilia stepped closer, her fingers grazing his. "We'll stop him. We'll fight back together." Scott's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "We don't have much time. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything, our bond, our future." Orfilia shook her head, her heart swelling with certainty. "No matter what happens, Scott, we have each other. And we'll fight for our future." For the first time in a long while, Scott's wolf settled at peace within him, the tension in his muscles easing. The fight wasn't over, but for that moment, he knew they were ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 18 The Clash of Wolves. The tension between Scott and Varec finally reached its breaking point. Varec had been playing a dangerous game, weaving lies and manipulation, stirring distrust among the nobility. It wasn't just power he sought, it was control, and he was willing to use any means necessary to obtain it. The final confrontation came one evening after the king had called a formal meeting in the palace. Scott was summoned to answer for his defiance, his bond with Orfilia a central point of contention. Varec stood at the center of it all, the mask of politeness hiding the venom beneath. He had rallied the court to his side, and now, with the king's blessing, he was about to make his move. Orfilia stood beside Scott, her hand clasped in his. She could feel the storm of emotions swirling around them, the weight of judgment from the court. Every word, every accusation thrown at Scott was like a dagger in her heart. But she wouldn't let them tear him down. Not now, not ever. "Alpha Scott," the king said, his voice cold and formal. "You have defied the authority of this court. You have allied yourself with this Omega in a manner that threatens the very structure of this kingdom. You stand accused of treason." Scott's shoulders squared, and for the first time, Orfilia saw the fire in his eyes. His wolf was awake, its hunger for justice and truth burning beneath the surface. "I haven't betrayed anyone," Scott's voice rang clear, a contrast to the whispers that filled the room. "I have fought for what I believe is right, and I will continue to do so. I will not apologize for loving her." Varroc's voice cut through the tension, smooth and venomous. "Love, you say? Or is it simply your desire for power? Your need to control her?" Before Scott could respond, Varroc advanced toward Orfilia, his eyes predatory. "Do you truly think he's doing this for you, Omega? Or is he simply using you to gain what he's always wanted?" Orfilia's pulse quickened as Varroc reached for her, but before he could touch her, Scott was there. His movement was swift and powerful, a blur of motion as he grabbed Varroc by the collar, his grip tightening with each passing second. The room fell silent as Scott's wolf roared in response, the air thick with the primal energy between them. "I will not let you touch her," Scott growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You will never lay a hand on her again." The king, who had been watching with growing unease, stood and raised a hand to signal for calm. Enough. But the damage had been done. The room was divided. Scott had shown his power, his commitment to Orfilia, but the question was no longer whether he had the strength to defend her. It was whether he could maintain his position in the face of Varroc's rising influence. Chapter 19, Tipping the Scales. In the aftermath of the confrontation with Varroc, things in the palace began to spiral. Varroc's supporters grew bolder, and Scott found himself increasingly isolated. The court was turning against him, and even the king, once a figure of stability, seemed uncertain of where his loyalties lay. Orfilia, though shaken, stood firm beside him. But even she couldn't ignore the growing fear that their bond would be the one thing that led to their undoing. The stakes had never been higher. Their love, so beautiful and powerful, was now the very thing that threatened to tear them apart. But neither Orfilia nor Scott was willing to give up. Together they would stand, fight, and claim their future. The king summoned Scott once more, a final meeting to determine his fate. Orfilia knew that this was the moment. This was their chance to end the game that had been played at their expense. As they walked into the throne room, Orfilia could feel Scott's tension. But there was something else in his eyes, a determination to fight for their love. They had come too far to lose now. Chapter 20. The Final Battle. The throne room was silent, the weight of the court's eyes on them as they stood before the king. Varroc's smirk was still in place, though it seemed a little less certain now. He had lost ground in the past days, but he wouldn't back down without one last push. Scott's voice rang out across the room, his tone firm and unwavering. "I refuse to stand down. You may have the power to control this court, but you cannot control love. Orfilia and I will not be torn apart." The king studied him for a long time, his eyes sharp. "You speak of love, but power is the only thing that matters in this kingdom. You forget your place, Scott. And so does she." "I've never forgotten my place," Scott replied. "It's beside her. Always." The final battle had begun. Orfilia stepped forward, her hand finding Scott's once more. She was no longer afraid. They would win this fight or they would lose everything together. And in that moment she knew she would face it all with him. Whatever came next, she wouldn't back down. Neither would he. Chapter 21. The Final Gamble. The court had grown restless. Every corner of the palace was filled with whispers, rumors swirling like a storm. The nobles, advisors, and even the servants watched with bated breath as the fate of Scott and Orfilia hung in the balance. The power struggle had reached its peak, and it seemed that only one outcome was possible: victory or defeat. Scott and Orfilia had been summoned again, this time for a final hearing, a last chance to plead their case before the king and the council. Varrick's influence had grown stronger with each passing day, and his plan to take Scott down was inching closer to success. But neither Scott nor Orfilia had come this far to surrender now. They had fought for each other and for their love, and they were not going to let the court decide their future. As they walked together into the throne room, the weight of what was at stake pressed heavily on their shoulders. The king sat at his dais, his eyes cold and calculating. Varrick stood at his side, a self-assured smirk on his lips. But Orfilia could see the cracks in his facade, the nervousness lurking beneath his confident exterior. This time the power balance had shifted, and Scott and Orfilia were no longer the ones on the defensive. Orfilia squeezed Scott's hand, offering him a reassuring smile, even though her heart pounded in her chest. She had never been one for politics, but the stakes had never been so personal. She would stand by Scott no matter what. Scott met her gaze, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "We're in this together," he whispered, his voice a grounding force. As they stood before the king, Varrick was the first to speak, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "I trust you've come to your senses, Scott? You've caused quite a stir, haven't you? The future of this kingdom is at risk." Scott's jaw tightened, but he did not falter. "The future of this kingdom depends on loyalty, on truth, not on manipulation and lies." Varrick stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Truth? You speak of truth, but what about the truth that you've abandoned your duty, your responsibility to your people? And what of her?" He gestured to Orfilia, his eyes gleaming with disdain. "An Omega, no less. A maid. Do you truly believe this kingdom will stand with you?" The venom in Varrick's words hung heavy in the air, but Orfilia stood tall, her chin raised. "I don't care about titles," she said firmly. "What matters is the bond we share, the love and loyalty we have for each other. You may try to tear us apart, but you will fail. Scott and I have made our choice." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. The king, his expression unreadable, finally spoke. "You speak of love, Orfilia, but love is not enough to lead a kingdom. You both know the cost of your actions. I cannot allow this to continue." Scott's voice rose, his tone unwavering. "Then we'll face the cost. But we will face it together. We have fought for what we believe is right, and we will not be silenced by fear." The king's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He had seen the power in Scott's resolve, and he knew that if he pushed too hard, he would lose the support of the court. Varrick, too, had underestimated the bond between Scott and Orfilia. The strength they shared was undeniable, and in that moment the tide turned. The king stood slowly, his expression shifting from coldness to something akin to respect. "Perhaps there is more to this than I realized. Scott, Orfilia, I have seen the truth in your eyes, and while I cannot condone your actions, I understand your resolve." The room was quiet as the king's words settled in. The decision had been made. "You may remain," the king declared. "But know this, your path will be difficult. You will face opposition, and the road ahead will not be easy. But if you stand by each other as you say, then it is your right to fight for what you believe in." Orfilia and Scott exchanged a look, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and resolve. They had won this battle not with force, but with their unwavering love and loyalty to each other. The fight wasn't over, but they had proven that they were strong enough to face whatever came next. Chapter 22: The Aftermath. The court's decision to allow Scott and Orfilia to remain together was a momentous one, but it was not without consequences. Though they had earned the king's begrudging approval, the nobles and advisors were still divided. Some supported their bond, while others saw it as a threat to the status quo. Varrick, though temporarily defeated, had not given up. He continued to work in the shadows, waiting for another opportunity to strike. But for now Scott and Orfilia could breathe. The immediate danger had passed, and they could begin to rebuild their lives together. They knew that their bond would always be tested, but for the first time they were no longer afraid. In the days that followed, they spent more time together, alone without the watchful eyes of the court. Scott showed Orfilia the hidden parts of the palace, the gardens where they could escape, the secret corridors where they could be themselves. Every moment with him felt like a precious gift, and Orfilia cherished it. One evening, as they sat together beneath the stars in the palace's secluded garden, Orfilia turned to Scott, her eyes shining with the love she had never thought possible. "I never thought I'd find happiness like this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Scott smiled, his hand gently caressing hers. "Neither did I. But you've shown me that love is worth fighting for, no matter the cost." Chapter 23. The battle continues. Though their relationship had been accepted, the court was far from peaceful. Varric continued to plot, using every means at his disposal to try and tear them apart. His schemes were subtle, creeping into the palace like a poison. But Scott and Orfilia were prepared. They knew that this battle, this war of hearts and wills, was far from over. They learned to navigate the court's intricacies with careful strategy, using their bond as both a strength and a shield. They made allies, strengthened their position, and worked together to uncover Varric's most insidious plans. Through it all, their love only grew stronger. Every challenge they faced, every obstacle they overcame, deepened their connection. And with each passing day, they became more united, more determined to protect what they had built. Chapter 24. The final confrontation. The day came when Varric made his final move. He had gathered a faction of disgruntled nobles, all eager to see Scott and Orfilia fall. But they had underestimated the strength of their bond. Scott and Orfilia, now fully in control of their future, confronted Varric in the palace courtyard, the tension between them thick with the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. "You've lost, Varric," Scott said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "The court sees through your lies. Your schemes have only made us stronger." Varric's eyes flickered with anger, but there was no more confidence in his stance. "You think you've won? This is only the beginning, Scott. You'll never have peace." "We've already won," Orfilia said, her voice unwavering. "The love we share is stronger than anything you can do to destroy us." The final confrontation was swift. Varric, realizing that his power was slipping away, made one last attempt to turn the court against them, but it was too late. The nobles had already sided with Scott and Orfilia, recognizing the strength in their unity and the truth in their love. Varric was exiled, his power broken, and peace was restored to the court. Chapter 25. A new beginning. In the aftermath of the conflict, Scott and Orfilia stood together, stronger than ever. The road had been long, filled with trials and challenges, but they had weathered the storm. And now, with Varric's defeat, the future was theirs to shape. They stood at the balcony of the palace, looking out over the kingdom that had once torn them apart. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the land. In the distance, the sounds of the kingdom at peace echoed in their ears, a symphony of life and hope. Scott wrapped his arm around Orfilia, pulling her close. She leaned into him, her heart full as she looked out at the horizon. Together they had fought for their love, and now they could finally build the life they had always dreamed of. "I never thought this day would come," Orfilia said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Scott kissed her forehead, his voice full of promise. "This is only the beginning. We have everything ahead of us, Orfilia. Together." And as they stood there, in the quiet peace of the moment, Orfilia knew that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. Their love, their bond was unbreakable. And that was all they needed. The end of one battle was just the beginning of their story. Together they were unstoppable.